Hello, Penny and Mike.
Hi.
So as a reminder, these notes are available on the church website under resources. And if you're online right now and you want to pull them up, you can. They are available there. And I've printed out here half of the sheets, the staples on the wrong side, so it's going to look odd. We're beginning with the slide that says whichever he adopts, whichever he adopts. Okay, that's where we're. I apologize for the staple, the great staple controversy.
All of that ones are right here. Nobody's using it.
But you've got front and back. That's good.
Front and back, yeah. Okay, so let's begin with a quote from C.S. Lewis. This is from the Screwtape Letters. Many of you are probably familiar with that book. This fictionalized account of demons conversing about the best way to take us down. So there's this section here that relates to politics. So this is the conversation between the demons, Screwtape and Wormwood, talking about Wormwood's what was it, a patient? Is that what they call them? The person he's trying to take down. So whichever he adopts, your main task will be the same. Let him begin by treating the patriotism or the pacifism as part of his religion. So remember, this is being written during the war. Then let him, under the influence of partisan spirit, come to regard it as the most important part. Then quietly and gradually nurse him onto the stage at which the religion becomes merely part of the cause, in which Christianity is valued chiefly because of the excellent arguments it can produce in favor of the British war effort or of pacifism. The attitude which you want to guard against is that in which temporal affairs are treated primarily as material for obedience. Once you have made the world an end and faith a means, you've almost won your man. And it makes very little difference what kind of worldly end he is pursuing, provided that meetings, pamphlets, policies, movements, causes, and crusades matter more to him than prayers and sacraments and charity. He is ours. And the more religious on those terms, the more securely ours. I could show you a pretty cage full down here. Okay, so question, what lesson is Lewis making regarding politics?
That they become the focus basically of our worship. Like we worship the cause that we are particularly interested in. And I don't think it necessarily is just national politics. I've seen that happen, let's say, in some of our Christian universities where it feels like the community is more interested in the promotion of the university than it is in the development of faith and the people, or the development of faith in the church.
So cause becomes the object of worship. Yeah.
Pretty much the same thing as Lee Camp on either, what is it, neither
Right.
chaplain or prostitute.
Oh, okay.
Screwtape is, or whoever, Wormwood or Screwtape is assuming that that your faith then just becomes a means. And I mean, it describes American religion, a lot of American religion very well. So my train of thought here. So I'm just going to pass it on.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but your faith just becomes a means to get people on whatever side people want. I mean, it's been used forever. And, you could always rely, if you put the abortion debate out there, you could always rely on certain faith people to line up, to give you their vote, to do that. It was but it was a means to an end to line up people for one particular point of view. It was
Yeah.
just a,
And on
Just
both
using-
sides of the issue.
right. And other issues could happen the same way on
Yeah.
other sides. It's
Yeah.
not just like the abortion issue or
Yeah.
whatever, but,
Yeah.
but it's just saying, well, if we point out to Christians, it's blah, 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 then they will get on our side. And if we point out to the, it's just
Okay.
using it as a means.
Any wisdom from online there, Julie?
So it kind of reminds me when we were doing the I can't remember the guy's name, the prepositions for God versus with God, and I know.
Oh, yeah, Sky Giovanni.
Yeah, on for God, and it's when the mission becomes more important than your relationship than God. The mission's more important than God.
Yeah,
And he has a lot to say about that, and I remember feeling pretty convicted about it in a lot of ways, because whatever your mission is, sometimes it does become more, and then that does blow up pretty fast.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I've forgotten about that. You have a good memory.
Well, I taught the class on that. It helped.
Well, I mean, I bought the book. I didn't remember. Okay, so interesting article here in the Atlantic last year by Shadi Hamid called "America Without God," subtitled "As Religious Faith Has Declined, Ideological Intensity has risen. Will the quest for secular redemption through politics doom the American idea?" Okay, so just a few quotes from this long article. The United States, he writes, has long been a holdout among Western democracies, uniquely and perhaps even suspiciously devout. From 1937 to 1998, church membership remained relatively constant, hovering about 70%. Then something happened. Over the past 2 decades, that number has dropped to less than 50%, the sharpest recorded decline in American history. Meanwhile, the nones, atheists, agnostics, those claiming no religion, have grown rapidly and today represent 1/4 of the population. But if secularists hoped that declining religiosity would make for more rational politics, drained of faith's inflaming passions, they are likely disappointed. As Christianity's hold, in particular, has weakened, ideological intensity and fragmentation have risen. American faith, it turns out, is as fervent as ever. It's just that what was once religious belief has now been channeled into political belief. Political debates over what America is supposed to mean have taken on the character of theological disputations. This is what religion without religion looks like. So what do you think of that proposal that a decline in religion has resulted in politics becoming the religion of the United States?
It doesn't make sense. I don't see how that makes any sense.
So that doesn't make sense to you.
No, it doesn't.
Okay. Okay.
But I've seen, and I'm not going to say them out loud, but I can think through a number of people who have been a part of our church family, who I continue to see, like say on Facebook, and so I hear their fervor about certain topics which they conflate with their faith, but we don't see them here at church any longer. So
Oh, that's interesting.
yeah. So yeah, so that they would seem to follow this framework.
That's interesting.
Yeah, for quite a few years, probably still true, that everyone's very gracious about doctrine at the Stanford Church of Christ. You could say almost anything, and well, if they didn't agree, they'd at least be interested. You have a very civil discourse. You say the wrong thing politically, and you see faces flush. And I noticed that quite a few years ago, and that's basically what this is Oh,
See that.
should we all see yes?
Mm, nice.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So
Mhm.
so in this congregation, you can, you may disagree drastically on some theological or doctrinal issue and have a very calm and rational conversation about it. But politics
But
inflames.
chances are you're not even disagree
Hmm.
all that much
Yeah.
on religion, I mean, on politics.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's
but I
interesting.
suspect that's true of churches in general. That the anger in let's say, a conservative church is not going to be over, a lot of things that used to be over, but bring up abortion or bring up gay issues or whatever, and suddenly the steam is coming out of somebody's ears.
Yeah. Anybody online like to comment on that?
I can say, like Debbie, that I have friends too that are less religious and more political. And, believe they still, they still have their faith, but it seems like it's not rooted around going to a church. It's a little bit more, rooted around politics, it seems.
Yeah. And, I think that might be one of the next two chapters in Lee Camp's book touch on this. And that might be one of the broad takeaways here is the temptation to focus our fervent aspirations about the future and the present in politics and political issues rather than God himself. And learning to be aware of that movement even within ourselves.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, I mean, I've seen this in other things too, where as you become less religious, is you stop internalizing God's word, and really having it be in your character. Oftentimes you become more dogmatic and legalistic, and not just in politics. I mean, I've certainly seen it in politics, but I also have seen it just in things like Amy Williams, a good friend of ours, her brother-in-law no longer goes to church, but he would come and visit our church. And like if a woman got up and spoke or instrumental music, he would just get almost walk out. And the man doesn't attend church the majority of the time,
Mhm.
but he's become just so legalistic about different things. And it's the same thing with his politics. He's very legalistic about it, but he's far less religious than he used to be. And I think I think the more religious we are, I would like to think it would cause us to have more compassion, strive more to understand, it just, I think that it can be that way.
Yes, it can be. It should be. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna just briefly look at the next two chapters, 6 and 7, and the propositions there that are there's overlap between the two of them, and then we're gonna take a side trip into Christian nationalism, and then perhaps go to chapter 8. So that's where we might go. We'll see how far we get. All right, so I've drastically reduced the content on these two chapters. So if you have the book, there's a ton more to read here. But so chapter 6, proposition 6, the United States was not, is not, and will not be a Christian nation. So Camp says, page 68, there are some well-meaning but deluded souls who stake the political relevance of Christianity on the claim that the United States once was a Christian nation, and that we must now work diligently to restore the Christian status of our nation. 69 through 71. However, neither God nor Christianity is mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. Religion is, of course, mentioned in the First Amendment, but the amendment requires freedom to practice religion as one chooses. And Article 6 of the Constitution maintains that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. There are references in the Declaration of Independence to Creator and Supreme Judge of the world, but these are phrases that any good deist could have and would have used. The Treaty of Tripoli, ratified unanimously by Congress in 1797, under the presidency of John Adams, maintained that the government of the United States is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. And he gives a number of really interesting examples here. I've just put one here. America cannot possibly be a Christian nation because no nation state can be a Christian nation state. For example, nation states maintain their existence through military might and standing armies, precisely because they are geographically bounded. The church, on the other hand, is an entity that lives according to and bears witness to suffering love. The church does not depend on self-preservation. And he continues on with a number of contrasts between a nation state and the Christian faith. Okay. And then Proposition 7, so we're just going to lump these together and talk about it. How Christian values and the Bible corrupt Christianity. Obviously, he's big into, sort of provocative, inflammatory titles here. So he says, consider the slave Bible as one egregious and apparently malicious instance of Bible quoting, especially by the government. It is formally entitled Parts of the Holy Bible Selected for the Use of the Negro Slaves in the British West India Islands. The 1807-1808 Slave Bible apparently sought to exclude texts that could incite rebellion and include texts that could foster obedience to masters, or such as one of the leading hypotheses regarding the provenance of the text. 86-87, that the so-called Slave Bible should cite Romans 13, in which the church is counseled to obey the rulers and authorities, while failing to include the bulk of the truly revolutionary and subversive texts of the New Testament, is akin to a recent episode with former U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, in which Sessions defended a zero-tolerance policy on the U.S. southern border, suggested that his church friends, who were being critical of the practice of separating families and keeping children within chain-link cages, ought to read Romans 13. I would cite you to the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the government because God has ordained them for the purpose of order. And then consider yet one more public hullabaloo. Alabama Supreme Court Justice Roy Moore and his installation of a 5,000-pound block of marble with the 10 Commandments exhibited with citations from the Declaration of Independence and the National Anthem. By the redaction of the biblical context, we might say Moore makes the 10 Commandments function in a way not originally intended. Nowhere is the narrative of Scripture exhibited, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. Nowhere the radical social implications of such deliverance is seen in texts like Deuteronomy 15 or Leviticus 25. Instead, Moore makes the 10 Commandments function as an artifact of U.S. sociopolitical conservatism and his redacted version of Christian values. Roy Moore's original wooden plaque of the 10 Commandments was displayed behind his judge's bench in Etowah County, Alabama Circuit Court. And one wonders why the 10 Commandments and not the Sermon on the Mount. Why thou shalt not steal and not forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Why no blessed are the merciful, no judge not lest you be judged, no love your enemies and do good to those who despitefully use you. why no citation from the prophet Amos and his cries on behalf of the poor and the marginalized? Okay, so that's the general idea. There's a ton more in those two chapters here. But let's just talk about these and other questions. So if America was or is or intended to be a Christian nation, how does that affect politics? Or if America wasn't and is not intended to be a Christian nation, how does that influence politics? In what ways is Scripture misused in the political process? In what ways could Scripture be correctly used in the political process? Should we only vote for Christian candidates? Okay, so all the easy stuff.
I would comment that I think sometimes when we say this is a Christian nation, all the writer or speaker might be meaning is that the majority of people have an affiliation or an affinity toward the Christian faith over against Buddhism or Islamic faith or Hinduism. Whereas we might, just in the same way we might say India is a Hindu nation. It really says nothing about the fact that it's not their national religion. So sometimes when I read that, I think you're overstating yourself, because I think it's okay to say this is has been a Christian nation. Doesn't mean that I think that's what the Constitution had anything to say. I don't think that's what the Constitution is saying. I mean, all of his points, I agree with those. But it just seems like it's a valid thing to say, hey, we're mostly a Christian nation because the majority of the people have some affinity with Christianity.
Okay, so your suggestion is, on the one hand, you can describe us as a nation that's predominantly Christian.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, that may not have nothing to do with our political process.
Right.
Is that
Mhm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or really the quality of our Christianity.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like if you go to some of these other questions, it's like, shouldn't Christianity have more impact on our politics? Well, you would think if Christianity really had an impact on our politics, we would not have so many people in poverty. Children would be well taken care of. There would just, our economic system would be much more socialistic in terms of making sure. Oops, I know, but that's what I believe. Because that's more, makes the playing field more even and more people, there's less people left out, and there's less inequality. So I think if Christianity was taken more seriously, we would have less problems like that. My opinion.
Mike?
I would say that if the churches dealt with issues that they should be dealing with, then you shouldn't have to look to the government to do that. And so I think we just have different opinions.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that a lot of the discussion, I still see the government as one group and one community, and the church is another. And I think that, there's been a lot of conversations about kind of I totally agree that the U.S. government is not, a Christian, it's not a Christian government, but I do think it's been highly influenced by Christians. And I think to the extent Christians can go into that community and influence it for the better, I think it's good. Now, there's the question is, as Christians, we should discuss whether it would be better for the government to do certain things or the churches to do certain things as Christians. And I think that would be a good conversation. But I do think that there are definitely two different communities. And to the extent we can recognize that, I feel like there's been, when people have really abused the fact, like there's people who are in the government who abuse the fact that they say they're Christians, and it influences, people are following them kind of falsely, I think, as opposed to, so there's been abuse there, but there have been people who have entered government that with pure hearts and have really made an impact.
Right.
So it's just, anyway,
Yeah.
you hit a little
Yeah.
bit of a nerve when you said that if the government was more Christian, that they'd be taking care of people. I mean, my view is if the churches were doing what they needed to do,
Hmm.
there wouldn't be people that would need to be taken care of by the government.
Hmm. So yeah, so I mean, you make a lot of really interesting points, Mike. And again, I want to stress, we want this to be a space on Wednesday nights where we are free to disagree with each other here. So one of your, I mean, it's an interesting point about the role of the church and the role of the government, and perhaps a failure on both sides here as we look at our own country and needs that exist within the country. And so your suggestion here, if the churches were doing what we are called to do, enacting the way of Christ, that at least some of those things may not exist. Right, Mike?
Yeah, and if I was a little emotional, I didn't mean to be. I totally understand. I mean, I don't want to be divisive at all.
No.
But you did hit a nerve.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I think most of the time when people use the word Christian nation, they're using it for a reason and it's almost always in a sense of we were, but we're threatened now. We have to fight because America is somehow becoming a less Christian nation or something like that. And I feel like it's going back to the being the means to an end, but it's like you need to feel threatened because we no longer have prayer in public school, or we no longer they're doing this or we're doing that. It doesn't matter. It's just a way to pump people, to get people pulled in and to feel like they're losing something and therefore they have to take action on whatever it is, XYZ, because we used to be one thing and now we're not, which is a thing they even did back in ancient Greek and Roman days. They always were like, we're never what we used to be, whenever we used to be great. Yeah, it's pure nostalgia, but it works. It's effective. It's effective.
Yeah, so I mean that's so on the one hand, the Christian faith could be used within the political process to try to restore certain defining practices within the culture that are Christian, prayer in schools or things like that. And then on the other hand, could the Christian faith engage the political process for much more than that?
Right.
For
Maybe
the resolution of hunger.
Or we act justly, love mercy, that sort of thing. We would maybe infuse that into a good way to live, but it's hard. I mean, we're not trying to, as a church, we're not trying to make a nation Christian by sort of getting it to act right, or, I mean, there's a balance there. There's a balance. You try to influence it to do the good things, but on the other hand, just having externals doesn't make somebody Christian or not,
But
Yeah, right.
as a Christian, if you see a policy that you feel like is disenfranchising people, hurting people, like last year I was involved with the criminal justice system. I thought there were some laws that needed changing and some change around solitary confinement, and they passed. I did that out of my sense of that was the Christian thing to do, in helping the people that were caught up in that system and being virtually tortured in their particular situation. So I, as a Christian, wanted to impact that political policy. and that happened. Other people were also trying to affect that policy who did it out of just more of a sense of their sense of ethic, you know,
Mhm,
which
mhm.
might not have been, could have been Hindu, it could have been
Right.
Muslim, it didn't matter, but that's what motivated me.
Mhm.
And I feel like that as Christians, when we see a government policy that we feel like is not consistent with our beliefs of how people should be treated and how people should, then I think that's an area which we can express ourselves.
Mhm. Yeah, good. That's a good example. Yeah. Back to Mike's point there. I was just thinking, Dale and I were at a lunch today with the Stanford clergy group, a small group of faith leaders sitting in a circle eating peanut butter and jelly, leftover sandwiches. But one from among that group was recently 2 weeks ago. He's 2 weeks into this now. Was tapped by the mayor's office. I forgot the title that he has now, but one of the things he's working with is affordable housing here in Stanford. And so he talked a little bit about the need for affordable housing here in Stanford and the lack of affordable housing and the impact that has on the rest of the community, and from Stanford, the rest of the surrounding cities and towns. And in so many words, he was also saying to those of us who are, parts of leaderships in churches and faith groups, and I mean, he was basically saying, and we're going to need your help as well. So I mean, it's just kind of an interesting overlap of these two worlds here of the Christian faith and congregations and synagogues, and a need within the community and the local government attempting to address it, and also turning to the clergy and saying, but we're going to need your help as well. What else from these two propositions here, this larger question of America as a Christian nation, what that means for our engagement in the political process?
I mean, I hope this is okay to say, but what comes to mind about why it's really hard to be a Christian and be a politician is they can never admit they're wrong. They can never say, I'm sorry. They can never ask for forgiveness. So, it really doesn't fit that. And it just seems really rampant. It doesn't matter your ideology or whatever.
Ooh, she's cheating.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. Yeah. Elaine, what would you
No, I
say?
was just gonna say, another question to consider is, does the United States have a class system?
Does the United States have a class system?
Yeah, and now, don't forget, the Christians established this country. They came here for religious freedom. And they have been the founding fathers, although they believed in a kind of deism, they weren't strictly, but still, when you think about the different denominations in this country that came here, didn't they form a kind of class system? That's what I think. That if you were a member of one of these establishing, like Puritans, they have their genealogies that they worship and everything. And it's only since a lot of different people came to this country who weren't from the established religions that equality gradually became a force in America, something that they believed in. I don't know, it's,
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
if you didn't come from, when I grew up, if you didn't come from one of these established religions, you were not in the same group.
Mm.
They put themselves above
Mhm.
others that came after, you know.
So almost like how it was so revolutionary that JFK became president, the first Catholic president, because Catholics were not
Yeah.
considered
So,
at that level.
so I don't think we have as much as a class system now as we did,
Mhm.
because people have fought for their rights.
Mhm. We just
But
have a money system.
when I grew up, it wasn't like that.
Mhm.
When I went to elementary school,
Mhm.
I was made to feel different, you
Mhm.
know, because I didn't come from one of the established religions.
Mhm.
They read the gospel they read the King James Version every day in school.
Mhm. Mhm.
Every day, every class read that
Mhm.
before class until I think it was in the 70s.
Mhm.
So I don't know.
And that was in
It's a
public
different country now
Mhm.
than when I was growing up.
Mhm.
Yeah, so we can see even in our own short history, the way in which there's kind of been an ebb and flow as it relates to the Christianization of our culture and our institutions, and the non-Christianization, the secularization of our culture and institutions. And this ties right back into that. You know, what is our goal as a nation and as citizens in this nation? Is it to Christianize that culture once again? Is it not to? Why? Why not? Which brings us to Christian nationalism. Fairly brief article in Christianity Today, 2021, written by Paul Miller. What is Christian nationalism? An explainer on how the beliefs differ, how belief differs from other forms of nationalism, patriotism, Christianity. So a few quotes from this article, and then let's talk about it. So he tries to differentiate patriotism and nationalism. So this is his way of doing that. Patriotism is the love of country. It is different from nationalism, which is an argument about how to define our country. Christians should recognize that patriotism is good because all of God's creation is good, and patriotism helps us appreciate our particular place in it. Our affection and loyalty to a specific part of God's creation, i.e. our country, helps us to do the good work of cultivating and improving the part we happen to live in. Christian nationalism, however, is the belief that the American nation is defined by Christianity and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. Popularly, Christian nationalists assert that America is and must remain a Christian nation, not merely as an observation about American history, but as a prescriptive program for what America must continue to be in the future. Christian nationalists want to define America as a Christian nation, and they want the government to promote a specific cultural template as the official culture of the country. Just what we've been talking about. Some have advocated for an amendment to the Constitution to recognize America's Christian heritage, others to reinstitute prayer in public schools. Some work to enshrine a Christian nationalist interpretation of American history in school curricula, including that America has a special relationship with God or has been chosen by him to carry out a special mission on earth. Others advocate for immigration restrictions, specifically to prevent a change to American religious and ethnic demographics or a change to American culture. Some want to empower the government to take stronger action to circumscribe immoral behavior. Here's the class issue here. Christian nationalism tends to treat other Americans as second-class citizens. If it were fully implemented, it would not represent the full religious liberty of all Americans. Empowering the state through morals legislation to regulate conduct always carries the risk of overreaching, setting a bad precedent and creating governing powers that can be used later against Christians. Additionally, Christian nationalism is an ideology held overwhelmingly by white Americans, and it thus tends to exacerbate racial and ethnic cleavages. In recent years, the movement has grown increasingly characterized by fear and by a belief that Christians are victims of persecution. Some are beginning to argue that American Christians need to prepare to fight physically to preserve America's identity, an argument that played into the January 6th riot. Okay, so let's talk about that. I think he attempted to write that in a objective, non-inflammatory way, but you might disagree. So are there elements of Christian nationalism that are credible, that are good in your mind? If not, what are the alternatives to Christian nationalism? And should Christians be patriotic? And if so, how?
It's very divisive.
It's divisive. Christian nationalism is
Yeah.
divisive. Mhm.
As you were reading that, Chris, I mean, what group would you say is Christian nationalism? Like, I'm trying to understand.
Well, I think the author of this article would say that many of those who marched on the Capitol were adherents to it's some form of Christian nationalism.
You think that's true?
Do I think that's true?
Yeah.
And I in terms of the way that
I guess I'm questioning the Christian part of it. I mean, I don't disagree that there's a nationalism that was unhealthy.
okay.
But I don't know if did you see people that were saying they were Christians driving through there? I mean, I'm sure there were people that were, but I guess I didn't see the correlation.
Okay, so yeah, so you would call that nationalism, like what we saw
Yes.
in January 6th, you'd call it nationalism.
Yes.
I think he would call it Christian. I think he would call it Christian nationalism because there were religious symbols on clothing or other, crosses and things like that that were prominently displayed
Yeah, there were Christian
by
signs.
people.
There were Christian signs. People were holding up signs and things that had specific Christian thing. Not everybody
Yeah,
that was
right.
part of it.
Yeah,
It was a mixture of people, but I
yeah,
mean, there is this Christian nationalist movement out there that is very strong in certain areas. I mean,
Mhm.
you see them interviewed all the time and
And their
And the
message
radio is-
basically is, this country needs to have more identity as a Christian identity versus other religions.
oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. They're, and the whole idea of Christian, exceptionalism for America, there is that strain out there. It's not,
I mean, Kath, I like the way you put it earlier, Kathy, just to say that there are people who feel like we've lost something through diversity, through secularism, and they want that back. They want to dismiss that secular piece that comes through diversity. They just I thought that you
right.
did that pretty well.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And there are some that really believe that there's a special role for America that we're missing out on because of the way that we have, let America become less Christian in their view, because if, anyway, but some of them really feel like there's a special role for.
It's God's special role. God
Yes,
appointed. role
God appointed special role for America. I mean,
versus
I
other countries.
yeah, I've sat in Bible classes with people and we were talking about this. And other people were like, no, I don't think that because, Christianity is to the world. It doesn't, and it's if you're from a different country, to say all this thing about America being so special Christian, but you know, God has a special place for it in a way that is not other countries. That's just not a Christian, seems not a Christian message.
Yeah, I was trying to remember, I think it may be Richard Mao has a little book called Christian Patriotism. And I read this recently, and I think I was in there, but he talks about that this sort of fine line between like recognizing that the United States has an important role in the world because of resources, opportunities, you know, a host of other factors, or on the other side of that, proposing that we have a divinely ordained, a divine, that we are chosen by God for our role in the world, and that's a fine line, but they can sort of diverge into very different ways of pursuing political ends. Yeah. Okay, well, I feel like that's probably a good place to stop. The chapter 8 is a interesting one that talks about the end of all empires end, right? Every empire fails. Every empire fails. People. Yeah, they're all people. So rather than jump into that joyful and life-giving proposition, we'll stop here. So again, I really appreciate the opportunity for us to, I mean, these are hard conversations. And so I appreciate the opportunity for us to come together in Christian love and unity and to have these conversations. So thanks everybody for joining today, especially those of you guys online.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Good
Next week.
night.
See you tomorrow, Ann.
All right.